Out on the unforgiving frontier, the past isn't just a memory. It's a ghost that haunts the dust of every sunset. For Evelyn Vance, a widow living in a fortress of grief, her heart was as barren as the Arizona territory surrounding her. She had sworn off hope, believing herself too old, too broken for love. But what happens when a thunderous storm, a force of nature, brings another force of nature to her door, an injured giant Apache warrior, the very image of the nightmares that stole her family? She said she was too old for love, but that night, trapped with a man she should hate, she trembled till dawn, and nothing was ever the same again. This is her story. The dust of the Arizona territory had a taste. Evelyn Vance knew it intimately. It was a gritty compound of clay regret and the fine milled bones of forgotten dreams. At 47, her own dreams were long since buried interred with her husband Thomas and their 6-year-old son Samuel under a pair of stoic wooden crosses behind the cabin. That had been 10 years ago. A decade of silence punctuated only by the howl of the wind and the clean metallic click of her Winchester rifle being oiled. Her homestead was less a home than a bastion against the world. Tucked into a shallow canyon carved by a seasonal creek, it was defensible on 3 sides. The cabin built by Thomas's own hands was solid cottonwood, each log a testament to a future he never got to see. Evelyn had maintained it with a fierce, almost obsessive devotion. The chinking was always fresh, the roof sound, the single glass window pane free of the ever-present dust. Her days were a ritual of survival. Dawn broke not with a gentle glow, but with a stark, brutal light that bleached the color from the landscape. Evelyn would rise, her joints aching with a complaint she never voiced, and stoke the embers in the hearth. Coffee black and bitter was her first concession to comfort. The second was the worn leather chair by the fire, Thomas's chair, which she never sat in, but often looked at its indentation, still holding the ghost of his form. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of her land. The well, the chicken coop, the vegetable patch, and the perimeter fence she constantly mended. She was a tall woman, made gaunt by grief and hard labor, but her shoulders were strong and her hands calloused and capable. Her hair, once the color of spun corn silk, was now a cascade of silver and gray, usually tied back in a severe bun. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a permanent watchfulness. They missed nothing. The flick of a lizard's tail on a hot rock, the distant circling of a hawk, the subtle shift in the wind that heralded a change in weather. It was this shift she noticed on a late afternoon in August. The air, usually a dry, baking heat, grew thick and heavy. A bruised purple stain was spreading across the western sky, swallowing the horizon. The wind, no longer a playful zephyr, began to moan through the canyon, carrying the scent of rain and something ancient and wild. A storm was coming, a real gully washer. Evelyn worked with grim efficiency. She secured the chickens, latched the heavy shutter over the window, and brought in an extra armload of firewood. Every action was precise, honed by years of solitude. As she worked, her mind, as it often did, drifted back. The raid hadn't come during a storm. It had been a day of searing, cloudless sun. The Comanches had swept down from the north, a whirlwind of violence and noise. Thomas had been in the field, Samuel by his side, learning to be a man. Evelyn had been at the well. She'd heard the screams first. By the time she'd grabbed the Winchester from its pegs over the door, it was too late. She'd fired a frantic, desperate volley, hitting one of the raiders, but the rest was a blur of smoke dust, and an agony so profound it had scoured her soul clean of everything but the hatred. Ever since she saw all of them through the same lens of blood and fire. Apache, Comanche, Kiowa. The names were different, but the threat was the same. She was a fair woman in most respects, trading honestly with the prospectors who sometimes passed through and leaving a bucket of water by the trail for thirsty travelers. But her heart harbored a dark, unyielding prejudice, born of the worst day of her life. It was a poison she nursed, a shield she held up against the world. As the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the roof, Evelyn barred the heavy oak door. The inside of the cabin was cast in shadow, the only light coming from the hungry flames in the hearth. She sat at her small table, the Winchester across her lap, its cool weight a familiar comfort. The storm broke with the fury of a divine tantrum. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so violent it seemed to split the very heavens, and lightning turned the world outside into a series of stark, terrifying photographs. She would wait it out. She had waited out blizzards, droughts, and fevers. She had waited out a decade of loneliness. A thunderstorm was nothing. She was safe inside her fortress, a fortress built of logs and stone, but fortified with the impenetrable mortar of her own grief. She believed nothing, and no one could ever breach its walls again. Hours passed. The storm raged a relentless assault. Evelyn must have dozed her head, resting on the table, the rifle still in her grasp. She was jolted awake not by the thunder, but by a different sound. A heavy, rhythmic thump, 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 against the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her knuckles were white on the rifle. It wasn't the sound of a fist. It was too heavy, too desperate. It sounded like a body. "Who's out there?" She called her voice, rough from disuse. The only answer was the roar of the wind and another sickening, wet thump. Her mind raced. A prospector caught in the flash flood, an outlaw seeking shelter. Her finger found the trigger. She would not be a victim again. Never again. Slowly she rose and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. She could hear ragged, labored breathing on the other side. A groan, low and guttural. It was a human sound, a sound of suffering, the part of her that was Thomas's wife, Samuel's mother, the woman who had once known compassion, warred with the hardened survivor who trusted no one. Cursing her own weakness, she slid the heavy bar back. The wind ripped the door from her hand, slamming it open against the interior wall. And there, framed by the maelstrom, was her nightmare made flesh. He was enormous, collapsing onto her threshold, half in and half out of the rain. An Apache. His long black hair was matted with rain and blood. His buckskin shirt was torn, revealing a broad, muscular chest slick with water. A deep, ugly gash ran down his temple, and his left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Even in his collapsed state, his sheer size was intimidating. He was a giant, a mountain of a man. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, Evelyn stood frozen, the rifle raised. The face of the Comanche who had killed her son flashed in her mind's eye. It was the same high cheekbones, the same proud aquiline nose, the same copper skin. Kill him, the ghost of her grief whispered. Finish it. But then the man's head lolled to the side. His eyes, dark and deep-set, fluttered open and met hers for a fleeting second. They held no malice, no threat, only a vast, bottomless ocean of pain. And then they closed. The rain poured in, soaking the floorboards. The wind howled like a banshee. And Evelyn Vance, the woman who had sworn to hate his kind until her dying breath, found herself making a choice. She let out a ragged breath, lowered the Winchester, and leaned down to grab the giant Apache and drag him out of the storm. The fortress walls had just been breached. The man was a dead weight, a colossal burden of muscle and bone. Grunting with effort, Evelyn hooked her arms under his, her boots slipping on the wet floorboards. She strained every sinew in her body, screaming in protest as she dragged him fully inside, away from the driving rain. With a final desperate heave, she got him clear of the threshold and slammed the door shut, barring it against the raging storm. The sudden silence, broken only by the crackling fire, and the man's shallow breathing, was deafening. He lay sprawled on her floor, a puddle of rainwater and blood forming around him. In the flickering firelight, he seemed even larger, a fallen titan from a savage world she wanted no part of. His face, though streaked with mud and blood, was powerfully sculpted. A strong jaw, a mouth that looked as though it had been set in a firm line for a lifetime, and lines of hardship etched around his eyes. He looked to be in his early 40s, a man in his prime, brought low by whatever violence had found him in the storm. Evelyn's hands trembled. The Winchester felt heavy, useless. Her first instinct, a cold, hard knot of self-preservation, screamed at her to leave him, to let nature take its course. He was an Apache. He was the enemy. To help him was a betrayal of Thomas, of Samuel. Their faces swam before her eyes, pale and accusatory. But then she saw the gash on his temple again. It was deep, oozing blood that trickled down to mat in his thick black hair. His leg. She could see the sharp, unnatural angle of his shin through the torn buckskin. A clean break. Without help, he would die of the fever from his wounds, or a wolf would find him before dawn. And another memory surfaced, one she hadn't allowed herself to recall in years. Thomas, his leg broken after a fall from a horse, his face pale with pain, looking at her with complete trust as she'd set the bone. "You've got the strongest hands and the softest heart of any woman in this territory, Evelyn," he had said, gritting his teeth. The soft heart had long since petrified, but the strong hands remained. With a sigh that sounded more like a curse, she leaned the rifle against the wall, well within reach, and knelt beside the stranger. Her touch was hesitant at first, clinical. She pressed her fingers against his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, thready but steady. He was unconscious, but alive. First, the head wound. She went to her stores, her movements jerky and uncertain. She brought back a basin of clean water strips of old linen and the small bottle of carbolic acid she kept for emergencies. The sting of the antiseptic would be hellfire when he woke, but it was better than the rot. As she gently cleaned the wound, her fingers brushing against his skin, a strange jolt went through her. It was the first time she had touched another human being in a decade, save for the occasional handshake with a passing merchant. His skin was warm alive. It was a jarring, unwelcome intimacy. She tried to see him as just a body, a problem to be solved, but the sheer humanity of him, the vulnerability of his unconsciousness, made it difficult. She worked meticulously, her focus narrowing to the task at hand. She cleaned the gash, which was thankfully free of debris, and stitched it closed with a steady hand, using a fine needle and gut string she'd sterilized in the fire. He didn't stir. His breathing remained shallow, a whisper of life in the quiet cabin. Next was the leg. This was the true challenge. She cut away the sodden buckskin, exposing the limb. It was a bad break, the bone clearly visible where it had pushed against the skin. Setting it alone would be nearly impossible, especially with a man his size. She had to try. She gathered what she needed: 2 sturdy lengths of split pine from her woodpile for splints, more linen for padding and binding, and a small flask of whiskey. She paused, looking at the flask. It was her one vice, a small measure she took on the anniversary of the raid to numb the edges of her memory. She uncorked it, not for herself, but for him. Prying his jaw open was a struggle. His teeth were clenched tight, even in his stupor. Finally, she managed to pour a trickle of the fiery liquid down his throat. He coughed a deep, rattling sound, but swallowed. She hoped it would be enough to deepen his unconsciousness, to keep him from screaming or fighting when the pain hit. Taking a deep breath, she positioned herself. She placed one hand on his knee, the other gripping his ankle. "God forgive me," she whispered to the empty room. Then she pulled. There was a sickening grinding pop as the bone slid back into alignment. The man on the floor arched his back, a silent scream of agony contorting his features. His eyes flew open wide and wild, but they were unseeing, glazed with pain. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure animal suffering that chilled Evelyn to the bone. Then, just as quickly, he went limp, his head falling back against the floorboards. He was out cold again. Shaking her own body slick with sweat, Evelyn worked quickly. She padded the leg, positioned the splints, and bound it all tightly from his ankle to his thigh, immobilizing the break. It was a crude job, but it was solid. It would hold. Finally, she was done. She slumped back on her heels, exhausted. The adrenaline that had surged through her now receded, leaving a profound weariness in its wake. The storm outside had lessened its fury, settling into a steady, drumming rain. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She looked at the man. He was still a threat, still her enemy in the abstract, but he was also her patient. She had stitched his flesh, set his bone. She had inflicted a terrible necessary pain upon him. A strange, unwelcome connection had been forged between them in the crucible of that act. Realizing he couldn't stay on the cold, damp floor, she faced another, impossible task. Her bed was a simple rope and wood frame with a straw-stuffed mattress. It was her sanctuary, the place where she wrestled with her ghosts in the lonely hours of the night. The thought of him in it was a violation, but the alternative was a fever that would surely kill him. With another curse at her own conscience, she began the arduous process of moving him. It took the better part of an hour, a slow, agonizing process of dragging and lifting inch by painful inch. By the time she managed to haul his upper body onto the mattress, leaving his splinted leg propped carefully on a stool beside it, she was breathless, her muscles trembling with fatigue. She covered him with a spare quilt, the rough wool a dark contrast against his copper skin. She stood back, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, and surveyed her work. The giant Apache lay in her bed. His weapons, a long knife and a powerful-looking bow, she had already found and moved to the far side of the cabin, placing them beside her own rifle. He was disarmed, crippled, and at her mercy. Yet as she looked at him, she didn't feel powerful. She felt a deep, unsettling turmoil. The rigid certainties that had governed her life for 10 years had been shattered in the space of a few hours. The clear line between friend and foe, between safety and danger, had been washed away by the storm. She pulled Thomas's empty chair closer to the fire, its familiar shape a small comfort in the chaos. She sat down not to rest, but to watch. She picked up the Winchester, laying it across her lap once more. The storm might be passing, but the true danger she knew had just begun. He was a stranger in her house, a ghost from her past, and as she watched him breathe in the firelight, she began a long, sleepless vigil, waiting for the dawn and for the man in her bed to wake up. The night stretched on an elastic, unnerving passage of time, measured in heartbeats and the drip of rain from the eaves. The storm had rumbled its way east, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the soft hiss of the fire and the stranger's breathing, a slow, rhythmic cadence that seemed to anchor the silence. Evelyn did not move from Thomas's chair. The Winchester lay heavy across her thighs, its coldness a stark contrast to the warmth of the hearth. Her gaze was fixed on the man in her bed. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every shadow that danced on the log walls seemed to take on a menacing shape, every creak of the cooling cabin a footstep. She was a sentry in her own home, guarding against an enemy she had willingly brought inside. The initial shock and adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a churning sea of conflicting emotions. The raw, visceral hatred she had nurtured for a decade was still there, a hard, bitter stone in her gut. She looked at his profile silhouetted by the fire and saw the faces of the men who had destroyed her world. It was a face of violence, of a people she believed to be savage and without mercy. But then her eyes would drift to the careful stitches she had put in his temple, the tightly bound splint on his leg. Her own hands had done that. Her hands had tended to him, fought to save him. How could she reconcile the two? How could you save a life you fundamentally believed was forfeit? He began to shiver, a deep, racking tremor that shook the rope bed frame. The fever was setting in a predictable consequence of his ordeal. Evelyn watched her expression grim. This was the turning point. The fever would either break him, or he would break it. His shivering intensified. A low mumbling started in his throat, the incoherent ramblings of a delirious mind. He spoke in a language she didn't understand, the words guttural and strange, yet the tone was not one of rage or aggression. It was soft, almost pleading. Against her better judgment, she rose from the chair and went to the bedside. She laid a hand on his forehead. He was burning up. The heat was a dry, searing thing. She pulled the quilt up higher around his shoulders, an automatic, almost maternal gesture that she immediately regretted. She snatched her hand back as if burned. "What are you doing, Evelyn?" she chastised herself. "He is not your son. He is not your husband." She returned to her chair, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But she couldn't look away. The fever was taking him, dragging him down into his own private darkness. He thrashed his head back and forth on the pillow, his words becoming clearer, though still in his native tongue. He said a name over and over. "Brother. Brother." The word was filled with a desperate sorrow. Then another word, sharper, full of anger. "Enemy. Cain." The name Cain was English. It sliced through the foreign words with a chilling familiarity. Cain. She knew a Cain. Jedediah Cain, a former army scout turned trapper who sometimes passed through the area. A man with cold, calculating eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness. The name spoken with such venom by the fevered Apache was a dissonant note in the quiet cabin, a hint of a world and a story she couldn't begin to comprehend. The hours crawled by. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin grew colder. The man's fever peaked. His breathing became harsh and ragged, each inhale a struggle. Evelyn found herself on her feet again, this time without conscious thought. She soaked a rag in the basin of cool water and began to bathe his face, his neck, his powerful chest. Her hands moved with a forgotten tenderness, wiping away the sweat that beaded on his brow. She saw the scars that littered his torso, old silvery lines from blades and bullets, a map of a violent life. But she also saw the smooth, unblemished skin beneath the powerful beat of the heart under his ribs. She saw a man, not a monster. In his delirium, he reached out his large hand, closing around her wrist. His grip was surprisingly weak, but it held her fast. His eyes, clouded with fever, stared up at her through her. "Our people. Every single one." He whispered the words, a raw, broken plea. She didn't know the words, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of loss. It was the sound of a heart breaking. It was a sound she knew intimately, for it lived inside her own soul. In that moment, something within her trembled. It wasn't fear. The fear had been a cold, sharp thing. This was different. It was a deep, seismic shudder that shook the very foundations of her grief-stricken world. She was looking at this man, this Apache, this sworn enemy, and for the first time she was seeing not the caricature from her nightmares, but a reflection of her own pain. He had lost someone. He was hunting someone. His life, like hers, had been shaped by violence and sorrow. Her carefully constructed walls of hatred, so diligently maintained for 10 years, began to crack. A single traitorous tear traced a path through the grime on her own cheek. She didn't pull her wrist away. She simply stood there, tethered to him, as the darkest hours of the night gave way to the first faint grey promise of dawn. His grip loosened, and his hand fell back to the bed. His breathing, which had been so laboured, began to even out. His brow was cooler to the touch. The shivering subsided. The fever had broken. Evelyn finally backed away, her legs unsteady. She sank into Thomas's chair, the Winchester feeling alien and heavy in her lap. She looked at the man sleeping, truly sleeping now in her bed. She looked at the basin of water, the bloodied rags, the evidence of her work. She had spent the night fighting for his life. The woman who had woken up yesterday would have put a bullet in him without a second thought. The woman who now watched the dawn streak the sky with pale pink and lavender was someone else, entirely. She was terrified of this new person, this stranger in her own skin. She had said she was too old for love, but what she meant was that she was too full of hate to ever let anything else in. And now this giant Apache had stayed the night, and in the long, fevered hours, he had unknowingly forced his way past her defences. She had trembled till dawn, not with fear of him, but with the terrifying, earth-shattering possibility that she might just be human again. Dawn brought with it a fragile peace. The world outside the cabin was bathed in the soft, clean light that follows a storm. The air smelled of wet earth and sage. Inside, the peace was more tenuous, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake of uncertainty. The Apache woke slowly. His eyes opened not with a sudden start, but with a gradual awareness. They were dark, intelligent, and for the first time clear. They scanned the cabin's interior, the hearth, the table, her rifle leaning against the wall, and finally they settled on her. Evelyn sat motionless in her chair, a cup of coffee held in her hands, her knuckles white. She had been watching him for an hour, waiting for this moment. Her fear had returned, a more rational, calculated fear than the blind terror of the night before. He was awake. He was a man. He was an Apache. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was a conversation in itself, fraught with questions and suspicions. His gaze was unnervingly direct, taking in her worn dress, her weary face, the rifle that was never far from her reach. He tried to sit up, a grunt of pain escaping him as he remembered his leg. He looked down at the expertly made splint, his fingers tracing the line of the linen bandages. He touched the stitched wound on his temple. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stoic control. "You did this?" he finally asked. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, deeper than she had expected. His English was clear, with only a slight musical accent. Evelyn nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Why?" he asked, the single word hanging in the air between them. It was the question she had been asking herself all morning. Why? Because Thomas taught me to be decent. Because I couldn't watch a man die on my doorstep, not even you. Because I saw my own pain in your eyes. she said none of these things. You were dying, she said simply, her voice flat. I don't abide dying on my land, if I can help it. He seemed to consider this, his dark eyes searching her face for the truth. He found no comfort there, only a guarded exhaustion. My thanks. He said the words sounding formal, as if they cost him something. My name is Liam. Evelyn hesitated. To give a name was to give a piece of yourself. Evelyn Vance. Liam. The name meant nothing to her, but it put a label on her fear. This was Liam, the man who had slept in her bed, the man whose life she had saved. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Survival dictated the next steps. He needed food and water. She needed to know if he meant her harm. I'll fetch you some water, she said, her voice clipped. She rose and moved to the water bucket, her every movement deliberate. She never turned her back on him completely. She was aware of his eyes following her, a silent, weighty presence. She handed him a dipper of water, and he drank deeply, his throat working. He handed it back, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The brief contact sent another unwelcome jolt through her. An uneasy routine established itself over the next few hours. Evelyn made a thin broth from a piece of salted pork and some wild onions. She fed it to him, holding the bowl while he ate, the situation impossibly domestic and utterly bizarre. He ate without a word, his focus on the food. Later she had to help him with the basic, undignified necessities of a bedridden man. It was a mortifying clinical task that she performed with a grim set to her jaw, and he endured with a stony, impassive silence that she somehow knew was a mask for his own deep humiliation. A warrior like him, a giant of a man being tended to like a child by a white woman. The indignity must have been immense, but it was a shared vulnerability, a chipping away at the walls between them. In the afternoon, she sat at the table cleaning her rifle, a task that always calmed her. Liam watched her from the bed. You know how to use that well, he stated. It wasn't a question. Well enough, she replied without looking up. You live here alone. Another statement. I do. For a long time, he added, his voice softer. She stopped her work and finally met his gaze. What do you want, Apache? His eyes held a flicker of something, surprise perhaps at her directness. My horse is likely dead. My leg will take weeks to heal. I want to know if the woman who saved my life intends to kill me in my sleep. The brutal honesty of his question disarmed her. If I was going to kill you, I would have done it on my doorstep or let the fever take you. It would have been a damn sight easier. A fragile truce seemed to settle with her words. The immediate threat of violence receded, replaced by a complex curiosity. The storm, he said, looking towards the now shuttered window. It threw my horse. I broke my leg in the fall. I saw your light. Lucky for you, she said, her tone laced with an irony she couldn't suppress. Perhaps, he conceded. He was quiet for a long time before speaking again. The name you heard me say. Kane. Jedediah Kane. Do you know him? Evelyn's blood ran cold. I know of him. He passes through sometimes. A hard man. Liam's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. He is more than a hard man. He is a nane, a coyote, a liar who walks in the skin of a man. He trades whiskey and faulty guns to young warriors, pushing them to raid. He profits from the blood of your people and mine. Evelyn stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. The Comanche raid, the suddenness of it, the ferocity. There had always been rumors of white men stirring up trouble, selling weapons, fanning the flames of conflict for their own gain. Kane betrayed my family. Liam continued, his voice low and guttural, with a barely controlled rage. He led soldiers to a peaceful camp, my brother's camp, under a flag of truce. They were slaughtered. My brother, his wife, his children. I was away hunting. I was the only one left. I have been hunting Cain for 2 years. The story hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Slaughtered. Families. Children. It was her own story mirrored back at her from the eyes of the man she was supposed to hate. The grief she had guarded so jealously that she thought was hers alone was suddenly a shared burden. The world which she had seen in stark black and white was dissolving into shades of grey. He was the reason I was out in that storm, Liam finished, his voice strained. I was close. I had his trail. Then the sky fell. Evelyn looked at Liam, truly looked at him, and saw past the Apache warrior. She saw a man hollowed out by loss, driven by a quest for justice. A man just like her. Only his weapon was a bow and knife, and his hunt was for a living man, not for a peace that would never come. She rose and walked to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The action was mundane, but it felt significant. It was an act of stoking warmth, of maintaining the shelter she had provided him. When your leg is healed, she said, her back still to him, this Cain, where will you look for him? He has a cabin he uses for trapping 2 days' ride north of here in the foothills of the Bradshaws. Liam answered, a note of surprise in his voice. Evelyn turned to face him, her expression grim. Then you'd best get your strength back, Liam, because the Bradshaws are a hard country to travel in, especially for a man alone. It wasn't an offer of help. Not yet. But it wasn't a threat either. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of a shared enemy, a shared pain. In the quiet of the cabin with the storm-washed world outside, a fragile truce had been struck, born not of trust, but of a common wound. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The cabin became a world unto itself, governed by a new, unspoken rhythm. Evelyn tended to Liam's needs, and in return he offered a quiet, unobtrusive presence that was, to her astonishment, not entirely unwelcome. The suffocating silence she had lived in for a decade was now filled with the soft sounds of another human being, his breathing in the night, the rustle of the blanket as he shifted his weight, the low murmur of his voice when they spoke. Their conversations were sparse, practical. He told her how to find a particular root by the creek bed that, when mashed into a poultice, would help reduce the swelling in his leg. She, in turn, described the movements of the deer herds in the canyon. They were like 2 wary animals circling each other, learning scents and habits, establishing a territory of mutual respect. Evelyn found herself watching him. She watched his hands, large and scarred, as he painstakingly sharpened his knife with a whetstone she had given him. There was a precision and patience in his movements that spoke of a deep, ingrained discipline. She saw the way his eyes would follow a bird flying past the open doorway, a flicker of a wild, untamed spirit that no injury could quench. One afternoon, he asked about the small, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It was the only one she had, a stiff, formal portrait of Thomas herself and Samuel, taken by a traveling photographer a year before the raid. My family, she said, her voice catching slightly. My husband Thomas and my son Samuel. Liam looked at the photo for a long time, his expression somber. He has his mother's eyes, he said quietly, referring to the ghost of the little boy in the picture. His simple observation, his acknowledgement of Samuel as a person, and not just a part of her tragedy, undid her. She turned away, busying herself at the hearth, but not before he saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes. He said nothing more, a respectful silence that she was more grateful for than any empty words of comfort. The fortress was crumbling stone by stone. On the fourth day, the shadow fell. Evelyn was outside, hanging some laundry on a line strung between two pines. The sun was warm on her back, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she had felt a flicker of something akin to peace. The world felt less empty. The sound of an approaching horse made her freeze. It was a single rider coming down the trail at a steady, unhurried pace. Her hand went instinctively to the small pistol she now wore, tucked into her waistband. She watched as the rider came into view, and a cold dread washed over her. It was Jedediah Kane. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from gristle and prejudice. Lean and wiry, with a face of sun-cured leather and pale, colourless eyes that seemed to miss nothing and value nothing. A greasy, thin-lipped smile played on his mouth as he saw her. "Well, now, if it ain't the widow Vance." He called out, his voice a raspy drawl. He reined in his horse a respectful distance away, a gesture that was at odds with the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Been a while. You're looking sturdy. Kane." Evelyn said, her voice flat and cold. "What do you want?" "Just passing through. Got word there was a buck Apache seen in these parts. Big fella. Mean-looking devil. Caused some trouble down near the San Carlos reservation. Figured I'd warn you to keep your door barred." His eyes swept over her homestead, lingering on the cabin. "Seems a lone woman like you could use a man's protection." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Every nerve in Evelyn's body screamed. He was hunting Liam. He had tracked him here. "I can protect myself," she said, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol. "I've been doing it for 10 years. Kane's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you have. Still, this Apache, he's a killer. Name of Liam. Butchered his own kin, they say, before running off the reservation. The army's put a handsome bounty on him. $500. A man could do a lot with that kind of money." The lie was so blatant, so vile, it took Evelyn's breath away. He was twisting the story, painting Liam as a monster to justify his own manhunt. He was looking for a partner. He was looking at her. "You smellin' smoke, Mrs. Vance," Kane said, suddenly sniffing the air. "Smells like you got a fire going. Company, maybe?" Before she could answer, he dismounted, his movements fluid and quick. "Mind if I water my horse? It's been a long, dry ride." It wasn't a request. He strode towards her, well as if he owned the place, his eyes still scanning, probing, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint that she was hiding something. Evelyn's mind raced. Liam was inside, helpless. His bow and knife were on the other side of the room from the bed. If Kane went inside... "You're not welcome here, Kane," she said, her voice low and trembling, with a mixture of fear and fury. He stopped and turned to her, his smile gone completely. "Now that ain't very neighborly. I'm just trying to look out for you. And for myself. That bounty would go a long way. Maybe far enough to buy a nice, quiet piece of land like this one. A place a man could settle." The implication was horrifyingly clear. He wanted the bounty and he wanted her land, and he saw her as the only obstacle to both. "I heard a rumor," Kane continued, taking a slow step towards her, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "about that Comanche raid all those years ago. Heard tell they were riled up because some fool settler sold them bad gunpowder, made them feel cheated, made them angry enough to kill." He paused, letting the words sink in. Funny thing, bad business tends to follow a man. Evelyn stared at him, a dawning, sickening horror creeping up her spine. It wasn't just that he knew details. It was the casual, proprietary way he spoke of it. The idea was too monstrous to comprehend, yet it planted itself in her mind, with terrifying certainty. A man who would sell faulty guns to Indians to stir up trouble was a man who would watch a family die for his profit. He might not have held the knife, but his greed had loaded the gun. He was connected to it all. He was the shadow that had stretched over her entire life, the source of the poison that had blighted her soul. The man she was protecting was the victim of the same evil that had made her a widow. "You get off my land," she said, her voice shaking but full of a newfound steel. She drew the pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked, echoing in the tense silence. "Get on your horse and you ride out of this canyon now, or so help me God, I will put a bullet in you." Kane's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into cold reptilian slits. He saw the look on her face, the absolute conviction, and knew he had miscalculated. He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. All right, widow. No need to get hasty," he sneered. "Have it your way. But a word of advice. When you harbor a snake, don't be surprised when it bites you." He backed away slowly, swung himself onto his horse, and gave her one last, long, menacing look. It was a look that promised a return, a look that said this was not over. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, the sound of the hoofbeats slowly fading. Evelyn stood there, shaking the pistol, still raised until he was completely out of sight. Only then did she lower it, her strength failing her. She stumbled back towards the cabin, her mind reeling from the confrontation and the monstrous revelation it had brought. She threw open the door and saw Liam. He had managed to drag himself from the bed and was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his long knife clutched in his hand. He had heard everything. His face was a grim, taut mask of fury and concern. Their eyes met across the room. The fragile truce was gone. The shadow from the past had found them, and in its wake, something new and far more dangerous had been forged, an unholy and necessary alliance. The moment Jedediah Kane disappeared over the ridge, Evelyn's fear gave way to a cold, crystalline fury. She raced back to the cabin and threw the door open to find Liam already off the bed. He had dragged himself across the floor, his face a mask of pained determination, and was propped against the wall with his long knife in his hand. He had heard everything. He knows Liam stated his voice a low growl. He will come back in the dark. A decade of instinct screamed at Evelyn to run to abandon the home that had become her prison. But looking at the man who shared her enemy at the photograph of the family, Kane's greed had helped destroy a new and unfamiliar defiance ignited within her. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is my land. We don't run. We fight." Respect flickered in Liam's dark eyes. "He will expect a frightened widow," he said. "He will not expect a hunter's trap." Their desperate alliance was forged in that moment. A plan born of necessity took shape. Kane would approach from the east, using the rocks for cover. He would expect Liam to be bedridden, a wounded animal. "He will not expect me to be outside," Liam whispered, his gaze intense. "There is a ditch by the woodpile overgrown with sage. He will walk right past me. My bow is silent." The risk was immense, a gamble with both their lives, but it was their only chance. As the sun bled its final colors across the sky, Evelyn helped Liam outside. Each movement was an agony for him, but he never made a sound. She settled him into the shallow ditch, covering him with brush until he became an invisible part of the landscape. "Do not light a lamp," he instructed in a low whisper. "Your fear is the bait." Returning to the cabin, Evelyn barred the door and sat in the suffocating darkness, the Winchester heavy in her lap. The waiting was a torment. Every hoot of an owl, every rustle of the wind was the sound of approaching death. She sat perfectly still, the bait in the trap her life, now wholly in the hands of the man she had saved. Hours later, after the moon had set, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. It was Kane, moving with a predator's stealth, his rifle held at the ready. He crept closer, confident and silent, making for the cabin window. He passed the woodpile, oblivious to the eyes watching him from the sage. Evelyn held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Now she prayed. There was no sound, only a sudden, violent lurch from Kane. He dropped his rifle with a clatter as his hands flew to his throat, where the feathered shaft of an arrow now protruded. He stumbled forward, a choked, gurgling cry, escaping his lips. His eyes wide, with a final, shocked understanding. Then he crumpled into the dust and lay still. The silence that followed was absolute. After a long moment, Liam pulled himself from the ditch, using his bow as a crutch. It was over. The dawn that followed was not a relief, but a grim summons to a final grim task. Evelyn took up a shovel, her face an emotionless mask, and began to dig a grave far from the crosses of her husband and son. While she worked, Liam searched Kane's belongings, finding only a few coins and the crumpled bounty notice for his own head. He tossed it aside like the trash it was. Together they rolled the body into the earth without a word or a prayer. As Evelyn filled the hole, she felt as if she were burying the last 10 years of her own bitter hatred along with Kane. When it was done, she walked back to the cabin, feeling hollowed out, ancient. Liam followed his quest for vengeance complete, leaving him adrift. Inside, the oppressive tension was gone, replaced by a vast, uncertain quiet. What now? Evelyn asked the silent room, the question aimed as much at herself as at him. Where will you go? Liam leaned against the doorframe, his journey at its end. My people believe I am a ghost. The white world sees me as a killer. I have no tribe, no home. His dark eyes swept the small, sparse cabin. For these few days this has been my home. Her heart, a muscle she'd thought atrophied from disuse, clenched painfully. The cabin had been her fortress of grief, a monument to her loss. But with him here, it had begun to feel like a shelter again. The words came out before she could stop them. You can stay until your leg is healed. It was a practical offer, but they both heard the deeper meaning beneath it. He looked at her truly, seeing the profound loneliness she had cloaked in strength. And after my leg is healed, he asked softly. The future she had refused to imagine for a decade suddenly stretched before her. It could be empty, as it had been. Or it could be something else. The mantra she had repeated for years, I'm too old for love, felt like a flimsy excuse. This wasn't the foolish passion of youth. It was a companionship of survivors, a quiet understanding between two scarred and weary souls. Evelyn met his gaze, her own fear and hope warring within her. After your leg is healed, she said, her voice steady and clear, we'll see what the sunrise brings. It was not a promise, but a possibility. For the first time, a slow, genuine smile touched Liam's lips, transforming his stern face. I will wait for the sunrise with you, Evelyn Vance, he said. And in that quiet moment, Evelyn knew the long night was finally over, and she was no longer afraid of the dawn. And so, in the heart of a territory that had taken everything from them, Evelyn Vance and the Apache warrior named Liam began to build something new from the ruins of their lives. Theirs was not a story of fairy tales or grand passion, but something deeper, truer. It was a story of courage, of letting go of hate to make room for healing. It proves that the bravest thing a person can do is to open their heart one more time, even when they believe it's too old or too broken to ever feel again. Their mornings were no longer about mere survival, but about sharing a cup of coffee, mending a fence together, and facing whatever the sunrise brought side by side. If Evelyn and Liam's story of courage and unexpected love moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the journey. Share this story with someone who appreciates tales of the untamed West and the untamed human heart. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Click the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter from the pages of history. Thank you for listening.